I didn't mean to find it. I swear I didn't. Yet here I am, standing barefoot on concrete that shouldn't exist in my bedroom, the cold seeping into the soles of my feet like it's trying to claim me. The air smells wrong, like a mixture of mildew, dust that's older than my building, and something metallic. Something patient. Something that's been waiting for someone to notice. It's behind my closet. A simple, wooden closet, the kind you think holds only clothes and old boxes. But I pushed a little too far, turned a knob that shouldn't have been there, and suddenly the wall gave way. There it was, a room that isn't on any floor plan, a space that doesn't belong, and yet it exists with the confidence of something that has always known it would be found. Time in there is slippery. Seconds stretch into minutes. Minutes bleed into hours, or maybe it's days. I can't tell, and I don't want to. The air hums with quiet awareness, like the walls themselves have been watching, waiting for me. I feel its attention settle on me, not hostile, exactly, but deliberate, curious, patient. I've stared at it long enough to wonder if the room has always known me. If it's been there, just behind the fabric of my life, for years, decades, maybe lifetimes. And when it noticed me, when I finally crossed that thin line between ignorance and discovery, it shifted, just slightly, enough to let me know it was aware and aware of me. I shouldn't have found it. I tell myself this over and over. And yet I did. I stepped back from the closet doorway, trying to pretend I didn't see what I saw, trying to convince myself that it was a trick of shadow and memory. But the cold concrete under my feet, the smell that clings to my skin, the subtle, impossible hum of life from within that space, none of it is a trick. And so I begin to remember the first night I noticed something was wrong with my closet. The night it whispered, quietly, that it wasn't just furniture. That something was waiting. That something had always been waiting. I rented the cheapest apartment I could find, which isn't to say it was bad, just small, thin-walled, and full of quirks that I learned to call charm. The kind of quirks that make you bang your elbow on the doorframe at 3 a.m. or swear you felt a draft in the middle of July. I laughed about them, mostly to myself. My life was ordinary, painfully so. Late nights at a job I didn't love, waking up too early for the trains, eating meals in silence, and repeating the same routines until they blurred together like a bad watercolor. This apartment felt safe, predictable, mine. The closet had always been part of that safety, or at least I thought it was. A wooden rectangle I shoved clothes into, boxes on top of boxes, the back wall never questioned. Until the air started feeling wrong. Subtle things at first. A draft on days when the window was closed, the faint smell of mildew that came and went like it had a schedule, a low hum I swore I imagined but started timing to my own footsteps. I caught myself checking my phone at night, scrolling through Reddit, skimming hidden room, and I shouldn't have opened this stories, the ones with 6 words of warning and 10 paragraphs of terror. I always thought, you notice something like that, except you don't. I joked to myself about ghosts, about creaks being part of the building settling. Old buildings have personalities, I muttered, a line I borrowed from some poorly written urban legend. I even laughed when I shivered in a spot of floor that felt colder than the rest of the room. Blaming it on some plumbing beneath the concrete, it was easier to tell myself these things were normal, easier to pretend I wasn't noticing patterns. But patterns have a way of sneaking up on you, and suddenly I noticed them. The way the closet seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. When I walked past, the way a faint scratching could start and stop exactly when I looked at it. The way my hair prickled in the air near the back wall, as though it recognized me before I recognized it. I never thought these stories mattered. I used to read them at 2 a.m., alone, headphones in, scrolling past the comments, a smirk on my face because I had logic and reason. I had routines, safety. cheap rent, a room with thin walls where no one could hear me scream. But now, every detail about that closet seemed amplified. The hinge that never creaked the same twice, the way the light reflected oddly off the polished wood, the strange sighing of air as if the walls themselves were breathing. The apartment was still mine, still small, predictable, safe. And yet, the room behind the closet existed as a question I couldn't answer. I told myself boredom was the only reason I would even consider it. Not fear, not curiosity, because curiosity is dangerous. Just boredom, and maybe a hint of that dumb human need to poke at things you know are wrong. So one night, I paused mid-scroll on my phone, sat up from my unmade bed, and stared at the closet with more attention than it had earned. I tilted my head, traced the lines of the wood with my eyes, listened for the faintest sound, and thought, why not? Not out of terror, not out of fascination, just because it was there. Because sometimes, the most ordinary life is the perfect setting for the extraordinary to slip in unnoticed. And that night, I decided I was going to open it. I opened the closet slowly, the wooden door whining like it resented the motion. At first, everything seemed normal. The usual jumble of clothes, the stacked boxes leaning precariously, the familiar scent of fabric softener mingling with the faint must of old paper. But then I noticed it, the back wall. It shouldn't have been there, or rather, it shouldn't have felt wrong. My eyes traced the paneling, and for the first time, I realized that the wall didn't end where it logically should have. There was depth behind it, impossible depth, a shadowed expanse that felt like it went on forever and yet stayed just out of sight. A panel at the very top shifted under my fingers, loose in a way that seemed deliberate, like it had been waiting for me. I hesitated. My rational mind shouted reminders. Closets don't have hidden passages. This is old wood, warped. You're imagining things. But when I nudged the panel further, a rush of air escaped, a stale, icy wind that smelled of concrete and decay, carrying with it that patient awareness I'd only felt in flashes before. The air wrapped around me, tugging at my sleeves, whispering, though I couldn't hear words. I spoke to myself anyway. It's just an old building. Drafts happen. Hallways sometimes hide behind panels. My voice sounded odd, echoing back at me in ways that defied physics. Closets don't echo. Not in a room like mine, with carpet and furniture. But this one did. Every syllable bounced, stretched, and warped as if the space behind that panel had decided to respond. My heart pounded. I knew crossing this threshold was a line you didn't come back from the same way. I could leave, slam the panel shut, pretend I never noticed. But I kept touching it, fingers trembling against smooth, cool wood that shouldn't be there. The passage revealed itself slowly, a thin crack widening into a narrow corridor. Shadows clung to the corners, shifting with an almost sentient patience. The floor disappeared into darkness, and yet I could feel its texture, rough concrete, uneven, ancient. The further I peered, the more the air seemed to thicken, alive with quiet insistence. I felt it move around me, aware, as though the room was acknowledging that it had been discovered, adjusting itself in response. I rationalized again. It's just a closet. It's just air. Nothing more. But rationality faltered the moment I leaned in and stepped closer. The air pressed against my face, carrying a faint, metallic tang that made my stomach twist. The shadowed corridor seemed to breathe with me, subtle expansions and contractions, as if it had been holding its breath for decades, waiting for someone to cross its threshold. Curiosity surged like a tide I couldn't fight. My instincts screamed to stop, to retreat into the familiar, to close the panel and pretend I'd never felt that strange, watching air. But instinct lost to fascination. I pressed my foot past the threshold, then the other, and finally my whole body, stepping into the corridor that shouldn't exist, into a space that was already watching me. The moment I stepped fully into the room, I realized it wasn't just bigger than it should be, it was impossible. The narrow corridor behind the closet gave way to a space that stretched farther than my apartment's dimensions would allow, walls dissolving into angles that made no architectural sense. My head twisted in disbelief as my eyes tried to map it. A corner that should have been 10 feet away was 15. A ceiling that looked low from one angle soared impossibly high from another. It was vast and intimate at the same time, and it carried a weight I could feel pressing down on my shoulders, a subtle insistence that I belonged nowhere in it. The floor was uneven, cold, stained with dark splotches that I didn't dare touch. Marks ran along the walls, scratches, scrawled symbols, tally marks in neat columns. Some were old, faded almost to nothing, others fresh enough to glint under the weak overhead bulb I found dangling from a wire. I tried to rationalize them. Some previous tenant? Maintenance. But the patterns were deliberate, too methodical to be random, too careful to be careless. The markings didn't just exist, they had been left as a record, a language. I almost recognized, but never fully could. Objects were scattered throughout the space in strange arrangements. A cracked porcelain doll sitting perfectly on a low shelf, facing the corridor. A small metal cup filled with what looked like sand, placed on the floor at an exact midpoint between two walls, and a notebook lying open, its pages yellowed and curling. I flipped through it, hoping for explanations, but it was mostly numbers. Dates, times, tally marks, some crossed out, some doubled. The chronology made no sense. Entries dated years apart were listed on adjacent pages, as though the passage of time in here didn't follow ordinary rules. Certain corners of the room made my skin crawl even before I approached them. The air felt heavier there, colder, as if the room itself didn't want me to touch those spots. I spoke aloud, asking the room simple questions. Hello? Is anyone here? My voice returned to me in odd fragments, stretched, delayed, slightly out of pitch. Sometimes a whisper followed that wasn't mine, echoing just a second too long, bouncing off a wall that didn't exist from my angle. The distortions weren't terrifying. Exactly. They were deliberate, measured, almost patient, as if the room itself was listening, calculating how I would respond next. I tried to move slowly, touching surfaces with caution, testing whether they reacted. A floorboard groaned under weight that didn't match mine. Shadows seemed to shift when I blinked. One section of the wall, just to my right, carried a faint warmth, pulsing in time with something I couldn't identify. I realized I wasn't just exploring a room. I was entering a set of rules I didn't understand. The space had boundaries I couldn't see, limits I didn't yet comprehend, and yet it tolerated me, carefully, deliberately, as long as I observed its unspoken terms. I laughed softly, a dark humor, the kind you reserve for moments when the absurdity of life stabs too close. Of course, I said to myself, of course there's a room like this, hidden behind my closet, defying physics, breaking every rule I thought I knew, filled with signs of whoever came before me, or whatever was waiting. It was absurd, ridiculous, and yet impossible to ignore. I stayed there for what felt like hours, moving through the space, cataloging details, testing acoustics, examining the objects with a morbid curiosity I couldn't resist. Every time I turned a corner, I expected nothing, and every time, the room delivered something subtle, a shift in shadow, a faint cold draft, a mark I hadn't noticed before. It was not haunting me. It was simply aware I existed, and that awareness was enough to unsettle the core of me. Eventually, I realized I had to leave. Not because I was afraid, though a part of me was. But because the apartment still existed outside this impossible space, and sleep, and work, and ordinary life demanded that I step back. I retraced my steps down the corridor, feeling the narrow walls close in, the air lighten, the impossible dimensions collapse to the scale of my ordinary bedroom. I stepped through the panel, closed it, and tried to act as though nothing had happened. But I couldn't. Not really. Even lying in bed, the room replayed itself in my mind. The odd angles, the strange arrangements, the echoes that weren't echoes. All of it gnawed at me, whispering that it was still there, just beyond the wall, waiting. And I knew, in some way I didn't fully understand, that leaving had changed nothing. The room existed. It was aware, and it hadn't forgotten me. I fell asleep with that thought pressing against my skull, and even in sleep, I could feel the faint, impossible pull of the space behind my closet, tugging at the edges of my mind, reminding me that ordinary safety was just a veneer, and that the room, which wasn't empty and never had been, was still very much alive. It started small, a single object out of place, a metal cup, the same one I'd seen in the hidden room, sitting on my kitchen counter as if it had walked itself there while I slept. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and swore it was a trick of memory, a dream bleeding into reality. But then there was a doll, cracked porcelain, seated on the arm of my couch, staring at me with an impossible patience. And the smell, faint, metallic, and stale, clung to the air, impossible to ignore, no matter how many windows I opened. Nighttime became unbearable. The room had started to seep through walls, like ink spreading across a page. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my bedroom, not matching any pattern I could identify. A soft, rhythmic scraping against the closet door woke me at 3 a.m., again at 4, again at 5. I would tell myself, it's the building. Old pipes. Rats. You're tired. But no. There was something alive in the apartment now, the same deliberate awareness I had felt before, and it was no longer confined to the closet. Sleep became a distant memory. I counted the hours awake, staring at shadows that no longer belonged to ordinary furniture. Doors I had locked clicked open. Locks I had trusted became irrelevant. I found myself double-checking, triple-checking, yet every precaution seemed trivial. The room, or whatever it was, ignored boundaries like they were meaningless suggestions. It didn't need to break in. It had always been here. It was just showing me the truth. Containment is an illusion. Sleep became a distant memory. I counted the hours awake, staring at shadows that no longer belonged to ordinary furniture. Doors I had locked clicked open. Locks I had trusted became irrelevant. I found myself double-checking, triple-checking, yet every precaution seemed trivial. The room, or whatever it was, ignored boundaries like they were meaningless suggestions. It didn't need to break in. It had always been here. It was just showing me the truth. Containment is an illusion. I laughed sometimes. Dark humor, the kind that rides the edge of panic. I'd mutter, sure, why not? Let's have a doll on the couch. Let's have a cup of sand in the kitchen. Why not? But even as I said it, my hands shook. My apartment, my supposedly safe little cube of predictability, was compromised. The invisible lines I had drawn around my life were being erased. And then I began to notice subtler things. Faint taps against walls in empty rooms. Drafts of impossibly cold air from corners that had no openings. Objects moving ever so slightly when I wasn't looking. The effect was cumulative, almost imperceptible at first, but relentless. The more I resisted acknowledging it, the louder it became. The room wasn't staying where I had found it. It was expanding, infiltrating the spaces I thought were safe, the spaces I thought were mine. I want to ask you something. Have you ever noticed something like this yourself? A small, inexplicable change in your environment? a sound that doesn't belong, or a shadow that doesn't obey the laws of physics. Maybe you thought you imagined it. Maybe you ignored it. That's what I did, too, until ignoring stopped working. The hidden room I discovered was not unique in its audacity. Its intrusion, its awareness, may be more common than anyone admits, and that possibility is almost worse than the room itself. By the second week, I had to do something. I couldn't sleep, couldn't trust walls or doors, couldn't convince myself that my apartment was still mine. I started to photograph objects, note the sounds, write down the times. Every detail mattered, because ordinary memory failed in the presence of this place. The room had not stayed in the corridor behind my closet. It had infiltrated my life, and I could no longer rely on instinct alone to track it. Documentation became a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting me to reason, to reality, to the illusion of control I still clung to. I began to keep a journal, a camera, a voice recorder. Everything. Nothing could be left to chance. If the room had been aware before, now it would watch my attempts to record it. And that, terrifyingly, seemed to matter little to it. It continued its slow, deliberate expansion, threading itself into every corner I had once called safe. I laughed again, quietly, because there was no point pretending panic wouldn't exist. Humor, I discovered, is a thin layer of armor against something that doesn't respect boundaries. Even now, I can feel it. The corners of my apartment vibrate with its presence, the air carrying the faint tang of that stale, metallic breath. Every step I take, every object I touch, feels marked by the fact that I am being observed. It isn't haunting me. It's reminding me, with subtle insistence, that containment is temporary, safety is illusory, and the room doesn't end where I want it to. So I made a choice. I would document everything. Every object, every sound, every impossible movement. I would capture it all, because if ignoring it failed, understanding it, if only in fragments, might be my only defense. I would write it down, photograph it, record it, and hope that creating a map of its intrusion could give me some measure of control, because ignoring it had stopped working. And the room, as I've learned, doesn't wait politely. I spent hours, then days, obsessively studying the room. I measured walls with a tape measure, paced the floor, counted steps, recorded distances between objects, and tried to map the layout. Every result contradicted the last. 10 steps one way might equal 15 the next. A wall that seemed 20 feet from the entrance would shrink to 15 when I circled back, as if the space itself was mocking logic. Angles shifted when I blinked. Corners appeared where none existed moments before. My journal filled with scribbled diagrams, calculations, and frantic notes. Distance lies. Angles lie. Time lies. I kept hearing the faint hum, the subtle vibration beneath the floorboards, and I realized I wasn't imagining the room's awareness. It was deliberate, almost sentient. The air pressed differently, depending on where I stood. Shadows didn't obey light. The room was alive, not in a breathing sense, but in a precise, deliberate way that obeyed rules I didn't yet understand. Then I found the journal. It was hidden under a loose floor panel, yellowed and brittle, written by someone who had come before me. Their handwriting shook with fear, meticulously recording measurements, objects, and the subtle breathing of the space. They confirmed what I had only begun to suspect. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't random. It was a system, a carefully constructed, self-correcting architecture of impossibility. They called it the game of space, though nothing about it felt playful. The journal had notes like, walls shift when observed incorrectly. Angles punish assumptions. Distances are punishers. Do not step where it asks you not to. Reading their words, my stomach sank. Rules existed. Patterns existed. but they were maddeningly precise, and obeying them required focus I could barely maintain. Each mistake the previous occupant had made, each misstep, was documented with consequences: objects disappearing, floorboards trembling, echoes distorting into screams that never existed. Knowledge came with the weight of danger. Every line I read felt like a rope around my neck, taut and ready. I tried to rationalize. If I could observe carefully, take measurements, track objects, then perhaps I could understand the rules without breaking them. But rationality collapsed inside my home. My bedroom, my living room, the walls I once trusted, they were no longer static. Each doorway threatened to fold into itself. Each corner might extend into infinity or disappear entirely. The room's logic was not human, and my human mind fought to keep up, scribbling formulas that fell apart the moment I checked them. I paced cautiously, testing boundaries. Every object in the room had a purpose, and each purpose obeyed laws I didn't fully grasp. A misplaced cup rattled when I walked past. A doll shifted its gaze with an almost imperceptible delay. Even the faint hum that permeated the air responded to observation, intensifying or fading depending on my focus. I understood now. The room was not forgiving. It didn't punish with overt terror. It corrected errors subtly, with precision, teaching its lessons the way gravity teaches falling. And then I broke a rule, not knowingly. I didn't realize until the consequences hit. I stepped too close to a corner marked in the journal with a cautionary note. The air snapped cold. Shadows flickered violently. Objects shifted violently, rearranging themselves with a deliberate intent. I stumbled back, heart hammering, realizing the room had just demonstrated its system in action. Logic shattered entirely. My apartment felt smaller, tighter, walls folding against me. And yet the hidden room's influence seemed to expand, bleeding into ordinary space as if reminding me of its reach. I stared at the chaos, trying to make sense of it, knowing in that instant that the rules were precise, unforgiving, and invisible until broken. I had confirmation that the system was real, but with that knowledge came dread. Understanding too little could be as dangerous as understanding too late. And I now knew, without a shadow of doubt, that a single misstep could shift the boundaries of reality in ways I wasn't prepared to contain. Logic no longer applied. Observation no longer promised safety. And the consequences of a single error could already be waiting, patient, deliberate, and inevitable. I started noticing things that couldn't be coincidences. The lights in my apartment flickered even when the breakers were off. A soft hum filled the space when no appliance was running, vibrating through the floor, through my bones. At first, I told myself it was exhaustion, paranoia, the natural result of too many sleepless nights spent tracing impossible walls and counting steps that refused to add up. But then it began responding. Not subtly, like drafts or echoes, directly, deliberately. I spoke aloud one evening, voice low, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Are you aware?" The room answered. The flicker of the light above me pulsed in sync with my words, and a whisper returned, not in the air, but in my head, echoing my own tone. Aware. My pulse accelerated. My rational mind screamed denial, but the evidence piled up too fast to ignore. It was aware. Of me. Of everything I did, thought, and feared. The whispers became a mirror. They didn't mock me. They repeated my own thoughts, slowed down or sped up, subtle shifts that made me question my own memory. I caught myself thinking, this isn't real, only to hear it whispered back as if the room was testing me, seeing what I would admit to myself. It was a dialogue, a conversation I never asked for, one-sided until I realized I could respond aloud, and it would change its behavior based on my answer. I began to understand its purpose. Observation, containment, replacement. That was what the journal hinted at, what the patterns of walls and objects implied. But hearing it respond, feeling it choose how to manipulate the space around me, made the concept visceral. It was not just a room. It was a system designed to monitor, catalog, and correct anomalies. Like a predator marking territory, but precise, patient, unyielding. And I was not alone in its files. Something else had been there before me, something it had contained or replaced. I whispered its name once, cautiously, the one I had read in the old journal, a name scrawled repeatedly among the tally marks. The air shivered, a gust brushing across my skin, and then a voice, not mine, murmured it back. I froze. Recognition. The room knew what I had spoken. It remembered. Its awareness was not abstract. It cataloged, it observed, it recognized individuals. It measured presence and absence, recording and responding, always one step ahead. And then I realized, the room hid more than its own impossible geometry. It contained anomalies, pieces of something else. A broken reality, a living misalignment, trapped behind layers of concrete and wood. And when I had opened the panel, it hadn't stayed confined. Something had slipped through, something uncontained, and now moved in the spaces I thought were safe. I could feel it in the corners of my vision, in the irregular draft that carried no odor, in the silence that wasn't silent. The dialogue grew more intimate, more invasive. I could not think without it knowing, not even my fear. Every whispered repetition, every echo of my doubts, confirmed its awareness. And every time I tried to assert control, moving objects, blocking corners, locking doors, it adapted. The room didn't merely respond. It predicted. It corrected. It waited. I laughed once, bitterly, because the dark humor that had sustained me in weeks past failed completely here. Validation of my fears. Proof that the room existed. Proof that the journal had been right. Proof that the system was deliberate, did not comfort me. It terrified me. Because recognition meant it knew me, it had cataloged me, and it could act upon what it had observed. The invisible boundaries of my apartment, the safe distances I once relied upon, were irrelevant. And in that instant, I understood the point of no return. Awareness was no longer passive. The room had noticed me fully, and whatever anomalies it contained, or had released, were now in motion. Every corner, every shadow, every echo could carry intent. Every thought I tried to keep private was no longer my own. I could no longer deny it. I could no longer rationalize. The space I had once explored as a curiosity was now an active force. Observation had become interaction, containment had become threat, and replacement was no longer hypothetical. The room was awake, and I was its focus. There was no retreat, no resetting the boundaries. I was cataloged, measured, counted, and the consequences of being noticed were only beginning to unfold. I crossed the threshold knowing exactly what I was doing. Every instinct screamed to stop, to retreat into the apartment that had once felt safe, to pretend I hadn't uncovered the impossible. But the room was patient, and I had learned, too late, that curiosity in this space was not harmless. It was the invitation, the mistake that set everything in motion. My hands trembled as I pushed open the panel, feeling the familiar chill rush across my skin, smelling the stale metallic air that had become its signature. The moment I stepped inside, everything changed. Space folded and stretched around me with a fluidity that made my calculations meaningless. Corners disappeared only to reappear behind me. Steps I counted became more than they should, more than possible. The air itself seemed layered, pressing different weights against my chest, tugging at me like invisible hands, reshaping my perception of height, width, depth. The room had no fixed geometry. It was a living map of correction, an architecture designed to identify inconsistencies and eliminate them. I tried to rationalize even as the truth settled in. It wasn't a haunting, not a playful trick of the mind. The room existed to correct, to align, to remove anomalies. People, objects, even moments of thought. Everything that violated its rules could be measured, recorded, and replaced. And now, I realized with a grim clarity, I had become the anomaly. I had observed, I had documented, I had stepped beyond the line that preserved safety. Observation had been my choice, and correction required entry. The objects I had once cataloged, the cup, the doll, the notebook, now seemed to guide me deeper, marking pathways and boundaries with a precision I couldn't see but could feel. The tally marks and symbols I had studied weren't warnings. They were instructions, invisible until obeyed. Each step I took was already anticipated, my movements folded into the room's system. The hum vibrated in response to my heartbeat. Shadows clung closer, and air flowed around me like it had always belonged to someone else. Panic, surprisingly, didn't last. It couldn't. Once the room had noticed me fully, once the mechanics of correction revealed themselves, fear gave way to acceptance. My mind adjusted to the inevitability. I understood, finally, that the cost of knowing this space's truth was total. Resistance was irrelevant. The walls, the angles, the objects, they were the law, and I was subject to it. Curiosity, the same force that had drawn me here, was the final mistake, the one that ensured I could not turn back. I felt the subtle pull now, a gentle but irresistible insistence toward the center of the room. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Seconds stretched and contracted. I moved as though through water, guided by a force that was neither malevolent nor kind. It was precise. The journal's previous occupant had warned that the system corrected anomalies. I hadn't believed it fully. Now, every whisper, every vibration, every distortion of space confirmed it. Correction was not optional. And so I walked. I stepped fully into the center of the room, feeling the last traces of ordinary physics dissolve beneath my feet. The walls around me twisted, folding inward and outward, as if the room itself were aligning every element, every particle, every thought to its internal logic. I realized, with a strange clarity, that this was not punishment. It was inevitable. The system did not care about me personally. It cared about order, and I had introduced chaos simply by noticing. My heartbeat synchronized with the pulsing of the space. I felt my body, my mind, my very presence measured, adjusted, and cataloged. And I understood that the correction would not end until the anomaly, me, was fully absorbed into the room's rules. I could no longer distinguish where I ended and where the room began. Curiosity had been the doorway, knowledge had been the trap, and acceptance, the cold, precise acceptance of the inevitable, was the only way to endure the final alignment. I had no illusions left. Panic had been replaced by grim clarity. The room's purpose was absolute, and I was a necessary correction. Every detail I had recorded, every observation I had made, every step I had taken had led me here. The line had been crossed, the rules tested, and the outcome certain. I stepped forward, fully aware, and surrendered to the system that had always been waiting, patient, precise, and utterly indifferent. Most people never notice. Most people walk past their closets, their basements, their attics, and see only the ordinary. They think safety is guaranteed by walls, by locks, by the predictability of floor plans. They are wrong. Hidden spaces like the one I found are patient. They wait. They do not call attention to themselves. They do not scream, do not warn, do not invite. They exist quietly, and that is what makes them dangerous. Curiosity is a filter. Only those who look too closely, who push boundaries just a little further, who allow themselves to observe patterns others ignore, ever see them. And even then, awareness comes with a cost. Once you notice, once you cross that line, the room, the system, registers you. Observation cannot be undone. The rules, the corrections, the consequences, they begin immediately, and there is no retreat. So most people are spared. Their lives continue, predictable and uneventful, insulated by ignorance. But if you are listening closely, if your attention has lingered too long on this story, if you feel the smallest itch of curiosity, then perhaps you are not so safe. Perhaps, like me, you are on the threshold, one glance away from noticing, one step away from something patient, precise, and indifferent, waiting silently just beyond the wall you call yours. And when you do finally notice, you will understand that ordinary homes, familiar closets, locked doors, they are illusions. They protect nothing. The rules are always in effect. The corrections are always waiting. And the moment you cross that invisible line, it will be too late to look back. So, take a moment and look at your closet. Just look.